we were so naive and innocent. That's the way we were brought up.
What year do you think was that?
Well, let's see, 42.
So the war was already going on.
Oh yes, and my brother was in the war, and we, believe it or not, we couldn't have a newspaper, we couldn't have a radio.
Do you remember when Pearl Harbor was?
Well, now that was after. It didn't happen while I was there. Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought I meant singing about D-Day. No, I wasn't in school when that happened.
Do you remember when that happened?
Oh, yes, indeedy. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and a man that lived in one of Dad's houses came by, and he said, "Have you all heard the news?" And nobody had turned the radio on. That was pre-TV. And Daddy said, "What news?" And he said, "We've been attacked by the Japanese." And immediately everything got so quiet. I was in high school when that happened, senior.
Did everybody know what that meant?
Yes, yes. And, oh, honestly, it was unreal. We thought, you know, we Americans who would want to come to all the way across the ocean to hurt us. And anyway, I went to school the next morning, and you could hear a needle drop. I mean, it was so quiet. The boys especially were quiet.
Did the boys knew that
they knew what it would mean, and the girls were all crying, and we were, you know, getting close to graduation. And two of the smartest boys that ever came out of our school were, the war destroyed them. They came home total wrecks, and they didn't live very long. And one of them came home without a leg, and I don't know, I'm sure more than that were hurt.
How long did your brother wait to date? Did your brother enlist?
My brother was, see, they had conscription before that, and they were just going to be gone for a year. They had a country song out, "I'll be back in a year, little darling, don't you worry, don't you weep." And everybody thought a year, and they'd be coming home. This was before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And my brother was gone 5 years and never got to come home. He went all through Europe, North Africa. He ended up in Italy. And he came home, and he was changed. He was a gentleman before he went away. Kind old ladies wanted him to take them places because he drove very carefully. He came back, he was a maniac behind that wheel. But he said one of his jobs was picking up the dead after a battle. And he said, "You have no idea what the stench was like."
That would do to you.
And, down home it was a custom at Christmas to shoot firecrackers, and like they do 4th of July, other places. And he said that when he'd hear a firecracker, it was all he could do to stop falling, right? If it's a mud hole or anything, that he wanted to hit the ground. And he had some physical changes too. He didn't get wounded, that you could tell, but now he was wounded. And he sniffed all the time for, I guess a year. He just sniffed.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Now, during the war, you met Frank.
I met him just before the war.
Just before the war.
Uh-huh.
Were you in high school then when you met him?
Yes.
Oh, you were. How'd you guys meet?
Well, my best friend ran in and out of my house all the time, and it was on a June day, a real beautiful day, and I had that long hair, and I had just washed it, and that was a major undertaking, believe you me. And I had washed my hair, and I was combing it out to dry it, and she came dashing in the house and said, "Oh, I've got somebody I want you to meet." Well, my daddy, he hated all boys, and if he thought I liked the boy, he hated and despised him. So I said, "No, oh Lord, no, you can't bring any boy in here." And her sister was married to his brother, and so she'd known him all of her life. And I said, no, don't do that. And so I she left. She said, all right. And I went into this room where I was by myself, and I was sitting in front of a window combing that long hair, and looked up, and there stood a sailor. And he said, hello, little girl, and I, somewhat speechless, said hello. And he said, I won't hurt you. And I said, well, I don't know about that, or some silly answer, because I didn't expect to see a man standing there. And he turned around and he said, I'll be back. And he walked away. And we got to see, he came home twice after that. So I really married a stranger.
So it was right off the bat?
Well, yes, and yes, it was pretty much that way. And my daddy, of course, when he thought that I was interested, why, he went through the overhead, got my mail and read it, and dared me to ever get another letter. And what I did was simply change the address. Near the school, there was a post office. You know, more than one way to skin a cat. And
so he was off at the war? Yes,
and
what ship was he? Was on a ship?
Well, he was on a lot of ships during his career, but when the war started, he was on the USS Atlanta, and he was down in the Solomon Islands, I believe, in that area, and they got into a battle with the Japanese one night, and anyway, things were going pretty hot and heavy, and he was an engineer, so he was down in where the engines were and everything. And anyway, the fighting was really, we were getting the worst of it. I mean, our ship was. And he thought, well, the people on top side thought that everyone was dead down in the engine room. So they dogged the hatches and closed them, and anyway, they couldn't get out. And well, they banged and they beat on the hatch and everything, and eventually somebody heard them. And when he came out on top deck, the place was littered with the dead and dying. And he had a brother who was a gun captain.
Same ship?
Same ship. And he went looking for his brother. He found a body without a head. He thought it was his brother. And he went to his best friend, and his legs had been shot off. And you can imagine what he was going through. He said there was flesh every place. After we were married, he couldn't eat hamburger for a long time. And the next morning, just about daylight, they heard someone calling for help in the water. And he recognized his brother's voice. He'd been in the water all night. And he was burned on his back a little, not too bad.
But he
recognized that it was his brother, the gun captain. And he had shrapnel, bits of shrapnel on the top of his head. And anyway, they took him to, I believe, someplace in New Zealand, and then on to Australia. And he made a career out of the Navy. His best friend died, and they finally brought him back on survivor's leave. And
that was Frank?
Yeah, and that was when we got married. We eloped.
Oh, you eloped?
We eloped.
Did your dad know?
Not until it was over with. And then I was teaching.
How old were you?
I was 20.
You were teaching?
I was teaching in a 2-room schoolhouse. I taught the upper grades, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And I just walked out of the classroom. There was another girl who could take over in my place. So we just eloped, and I went back to San Francisco. And
oh, you went with him?
I went with him. And
what did your dad say?
Oh, well, of course he didn't like it. Oh, no, my. And we had lots of good times. discovering San Francisco together and going to the museums.
How was that for you? Because that was probably a huge change from where you grew
Oh,
up.
it was, I'd never been in a city like that. The streetcars, I had to get used to a lot of things. But it was quite an education. And I couldn't get over. Every big supermarket was loaded with food. And back in the hills, we were rationed over everything. Miners wanted, or did go on strike because they couldn't get any meat to eat. And you could get meat. And in those big supermarkets, you had to stand in lines sometimes. If you saw a line forming out in the street, you automatically got in it until you found out what it was. It could be hose, it could be meat, it could be tickets for this or that. But anyway, sugar, coffee was rationed.
But out there on the West Coast, it wasn't?
No, they wanted us to keep our shades closed at night and not, talk a lot because the city was full of servicemen.
Why do they want the shades closed?
Well, they did it all over the country.
They're afraid of the
lights.
They're afraid of a bombing, being bombed.
Yes, and but all night long, every time you looked out a window, the spotlights were up in the air, crisscrossing. If a plane, they heard a plane up or something, knew a plane was up there, they put lights on it. You could see those like a big rainbow right up into the sky.
Did you work out there?
Oh, I would get a job. You could walk into a dime store and see when he was in, I didn't work. We found a little apartment. One time we lived in what had been a chicken coop. It was about twice as big as this room. And we were lucky to have it because I've heard hotel managers say to a young serviceman, no, we can't, you've got a child, we can't, first of all, the young man would say, my wife and child are coming to spend the weekend with me. I'm going out, I'm going to be leaving pretty soon for the South Pacific. Can we have a room? He said, nope, no children allowed. And
you had a child?
No, I had no children
right.
then.
Mm-hmm.
I was pregnant before the war was over, though. And anyway, they were, what was it, USS Tucson, I believe it was. Frank was waiting for to be completed, and it was just like the Atlanta. And so he knew a lot about it. And so they took him aboard that ship, and when it was finished, he went to sea, and Daddy wrote and said, come home. And I would have been a lot better off if I'd stayed and worked, because I had an apartment, and I could have worked and been there when he came in. But I grew up pretty fast. You can't be a Navy wife and not learn how to take care of yourself.
So you went back home?
I went back home, and my child was born, and Tim, and Frank didn't see him until he was, I guess, almost 5 months old. And when the war ended. What
was the next time you saw him?
When he came home and had left the Navy.
So he didn't have it. Did he have much more action on the?
Oh yes, what was it? The planes that tried to.
Kamikaze.
Kamikaze. Yes, he said that they had more trouble with them than anybody. I mean, after the peace was signed.
Oh, really?
Yes, and he went ashore in Tokyo.
Did he ever lose any? Did any of the ships he was on ever get sunk?
Well, the Atlanta.
That one actually went down?
That one actually went. Actually, it was one of our own ships that sank it by mistake. But now I don't remember which ship it was, but it was an American ship that sank the Atlanta.
Really? So
it was a cruiser.
So that's why you got the survivor.
Yes.
And then he went into Tokyo after the.
Yes, and he said he never saw such ragged, starved to death looking people. And he said that the American soldiers, servicemen, were told, you go in there and you start attacking the women, or you you know, they were supposed to go in there and be respectful. And I guess they behaved pretty much accordingly.
And then MacArthur, he was
Yes.
under MacArthur during all that, right? So.
And that was an interesting thing about MacArthur. Well, not about him, but one of his aides. While he was waiting for this ship to be finished, and we were sent to San Pedro. And that in itself is a story. But anyway, we went to San Pedro, and he ran into, over in Long Beach, he ran into an old shipmate, a Filipino. And this man was a prince of a man. And he was so very gracious and kind and to us, and he tried to help us find a place. And there was a great big, the people were against anybody that looked Oriental. And because
prejudice, really.
They were very prejudiced. And the three of us went from place to place. There'd be a sign, room for rent, or apartment for rent. And we would knock on the door, and the lady would come to the door usually, and she'd take one look at him and say, "It's already rented. It's not for rent." And I realized finally they didn't want an Oriental. See, that's what they did to the Japanese and
right.
all like that. And anyway, this man, his name was Lag. I remember that. Frank had been on a ship with him. And he took us to his home. And it was just a magnificent house. And I kept seeing all these, there was no one there. And he showed us around his home and everything, and was just kindest man you ever saw. And there were pictures all around of this beautiful, beautiful woman, Filipino woman. And I don't remember what her name was. But I asked him, I said, "Who is this woman? She's in so many different costumes." He said, "Oh, that's my wife." And I said, "Well, she's so beautiful in all these pictures." He said, "Well, she's busy right now making a movie with Gary Cooper." And she was playing the part of a nurse. It was a war movie. And, see, what was his name? Dr. Wassel? Some name like that. He played the character he played. I never did see the movie.
Was he in the movie?
He was in the movie.
Oh, he was too.
And she was busy that day. And these were shots of her that I guess that's taken from pictures she'd been in. And so we went there 2 or 3 times and still hadn't seen her. And then he asked us to come and eat. And we went one evening for dinner. And as we were eating, she came in the back door. And by the way, there was Filipinos all in his house. They were refugees, and they would stay there until they'd find work or someplace to go. And meanwhile, they helped in the house.
Huh.
And I remember they waited on us. You never saw such food. And she came in, and I never saw it. I believe she's the most beautiful creature I ever saw in my life. And she was every bit as nice as she was pretty.
Really?
And we went there for Thanksgiving, and we met some of these people. And this is what I started to tell you in the first place. There was a lady there. They introduced me to this lady. She was older. And they said, they seemed to show her a lot of partiality. And yes, and they all wanted to be doing things for her. And she told me that her son was an aide to General MacArthur. And she had a picture to prove it. He was walking ashore in the water, and her son was right behind him.
Really?
And I tell you, it was the most interesting time I had ever had in the...
Was it still in San Francisco?
No, this was in Long Beach.
So it was Long Beach.
That's where he lived, and that's where Frank was stationed. And I, at the time, was staying in a hotel over in San Pedro. So and I'd take the ferry.
You really had to grow up quick. from
Yes,
the hills
I
of
did.
Kentucky to that was a big change.
Absolutely. But I see I had read books, every one I could get. My teachers, I drove them crazy. I read college textbooks when I was in 5th grade. I had this one teacher in that one-room school. His name was, they called him Judge Stevens, and some called him J.I. But I don't know what if he had a name other than Judge. But we would have been heathens, I guess, except for that man. He taught us religion. We sang religious songs. He taught. I mean, he taught,
So
and
you
he
felt
disciplined.
pretty well rounded when you were out there.
As far as,
yeah.
And another interesting thing happened while I was there. He had a day off, and we went to the amusement park, and I told you I had this crush on this boy, Reed Bingham, and we were wandering around the amusement park, and I looked up, and who did I see but Reed Bingham
In San Francisco.
in San Francisco.
Really?
He was walking down the street in that area with two other sailors. And I grabbed Frank and I said, "Oh, there's Reed, there's Reed, there's Reed." He didn't know who I was talking about. And I dragged him after him, trying to catch up with him. And they went into a men's bathroom. Well, Frank said, "Now, what's his name?" And I said, "Reed Bingham." And so Frank went in. And he told me that when he went inside, one was washing his hands, and one was combing his hair, and another one whatever. And he said, "Which one of you men is Reed Bingham?" You know, he was a chief. He had to show his authority. And I said, Reed Bingham turned around and said, he was still combing his hair, and he turned around and says, "I am, but I don't know you." And Frank said, "No, but my wife knows you." And he said, you could see Reed's mind working. Said he wondered, well, what's going on here? And then Frank explained to him. And Reed came out, and I got the hug I wanted when I was single. And we talked a little bit, all of us did, and then he left, and I never heard tell of him anymore.
You didn't know if he survived the war?
And there was another kid from Frank's home. I think he was a distant relative. Frank ran into him, and he brought him home, and he ate with us, and he went out on the ship, and he was killed. They have a marker in the cemetery.
Really?
They didn't get his body.
Really, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lost at sea.
Mm-hmm. But those things...
That happened a lot, probably a lot then, right?
Right.
Yeah, those things...
But
on the West Coast, in that area, there's probably mainly sailors, wasn't it?
Well, yes.
More than Army
yes.
or...
And you'd see men being brought back when they'd be brought ashore, you know. Oh, it was just... You could see them
disfigured and...
Yes.
Yeah,
but it was pretty awful.
And at the time, FDR was president, right?
Yes,
yeah.
but his wife...
Is he the first president you remember?
Oh, no, I go all the way back to Hoover. I remember as a little girl playing in the floor, and some woman had come to our house. It was a neighbor, and she and Mommy were talking about how people were losing their jobs. And she said, well, that's just happened since we've had Hoover for president. And those words stuck in my mind. And then all these years, I realized Hoover was blamed for stuff that he probably didn't cause. But
FDR was president when
Pearl Harbor.
When Pearl Harbor and when during most of the war.
Yes,
right?
and then when he died.
How did everybody react to that when he died?
I remember exactly where I was. I was standing in the backyard. I was drying my long hair again. I just washed it. And I'd gone out to sit in the sun, and my landlady's back, I'd come out my front door in the chicken coop, and she had come out in her back door, through her back door, and I was sitting there in a chair drying my hair. We didn't have hair dryers, and I had all that long hair to do with, and she said, the president has just died.
He just died.
And I remember that so well. You don't forget, and I was in a terrible train wreck. terrible. We were just outside of Sacramento, going back to the base where he was stationed.
Were you by yourself?
No, I was with Frank. And when he'd get leave, a lot of times we'd just come home and then go back. Come home and go back. And it was before daylight. And I had awakened, and I was thinking to myself, I'd better go back and use the bathroom and get my hair combed before the mad rush starts. And Frank woke up, and we were sitting there smooching, and suddenly the train, instead of having that regular, almost musical sound, he was going bump, bump, bump. And I thought, oh Lord, we're off the tracks. And I knew it.
Did Frank understand that too?
I said, he didn't seem like nothing bothered him. After being on a ship that
in combat,
he just didn't seem to bother him. And I said, we're off the tracks. And he agreed. And he put his one arm around me and held on to, we had that double seat. And those things would whirl around. And he held on to me, I held on to him, and I held on to the seat. And that seat it just went like that. And believe it or not, it knocked my shoes off. I had on sandals. And it knocked my shoes off, and all around you could hear that luggage falling, and all the lights went out. The lights were really dim anyway because everybody was asleep.
Right.
It was a day coach, but that was where we had. They brought in unused coaches that hadn't been used for years.
Right. And
put them into service, and anyway, right over to my right. One seat ahead of me, right the last seat, there was a big sailor. Oh, he was a huge man. And a little tiny lady was sitting next to him. Oh, she wasn't big as anything. And she had to be 75 years old at least. And he looked like someone had hit him in the face with a sledgehammer. And she looked like she was dead. And all of this luggage had come down on those sleeping people. But when the coach kept going, I bet it went 500 yards without, just
off the track.
The coach we were in.
Right.
And I knew we were on a mountainside, and the coach went this way, and then it suddenly went like that. Just like a right angle, and then down. And I thought I was going to die. This is it. I really thought, and I wasn't afraid, because I felt like if the Bible was what it was supposed to be, I knew I was a Christian, and things would be all right. But I went right down. We went down. The coach did, and then there was a huge bump, and it stopped. And the Lord must have been with us, because most of the cars, when we did get out, and you could see, it looked as if the whole train had been like someone had picked up a box of matches and just thrown them down the hillside. And the engine was clear way in the distance. You see the coat of the engine across a highway, and the steam was coming out. And the people that worked in those places were killed. And the bathroom I almost went to was flattened like a pancake, and a girl was killed.
She was in the bathroom and killed?
Yeah, but when their coach stopped, everyone just sat there. It was real quiet.
Was it on its side, or was it still straight up?
It was straight up.
Still straight up?
It's still straight up, but all that luggage had come down and hit those people while they had no defenses.
Right.
And then almost within a short time, a bunch of corpsmen. There was a lot of corpsmen on that train, and they came to the door, and they had flashlights, and that was when I saw what was going on in the car or in the coach, because there were no lights. And when they shone those flashlights back through there, oh, it was horrible.
Let's see.
And they pulled us out of there, and we grabbed their suitcases, and I finally found my shoes, and we got out and walked back up that hill in mud up to our ankles. It was red, like red, gooey clay. And we got back up to the railroad, and someone had built a fire and made coffee, and we stayed there for a while, and then a train backed up to where the wreck was and took us back a ways. We got on buses, went around the wreck, got on another train, and went on into Sacramento.
Wow.
And from there.
So how was Frank when all this? Was he calm through that whole thing?
It was almost like he was in almost like a daze. He never seemed to show any emotion whatsoever.
Just like almost.
And for weeks, I'd go around San Francisco looking down at people's feet to see if they had clay on their feet. I couldn't help it. And I rode some kind of a ride in the park. We went to the amusement park, and I tell you, one of them did me. I never wanted. I did ride a train twice after that. I rode to San Pedro, and the train got stopped in a tunnel, and the tunnel filled up with smoke, and I thought I was going to freeze to death just from fear. And then I rode one home.
Did many people get killed?
Oh, 13.
13.
But a lot were injured.
Really?
13 is what was in the newspaper.
But he had been through so much, he was just...
He was immune, I think.
To any kind of anything, really.
That was mild,
yeah,
compared to what he'd been through.
Really, yeah.
But there were so many train wrecks. 2 trains telescoped while crossing the Great Salt Lake. One just went right into the other. And the engineer on the last train, he had a heart attack, I think it was, and he just went right into it.
So you just, yeah.
There was just so many.
So when you were out in California, how many kids did you have by then?
None.
So you didn't have any kids in California?
Mm-mm. I had a miscarriage, but no.
But then they came back.
And then I got pregnant while he was, when he was having some kind of shore duty or waiting for something. And he was going out. I remember we gave up our apartment and we spent the night in this rooming house. And he left early that morning to go back to active duty. And at daylight, I caught a train for
back.
Well, I believe it's the best I remember. I rode a ferry over to Oakland, and then got on the train. And I would come into Ashland, and then from Ashland I would get a bus home. And
so after the war was over,
he got out of the Navy.
He got out,
and you could stay out so many days. I think it was 90 days. I'm not sure, but I think it was 90 days, like 3 months. And you could go back in at your next lower rate. Now, he was a warrant officer when he got out of the Navy. And he went back in as chief. And he stayed a chief until he retired. And he was promoted to chief warrant.
Chief warrant. Yeah.
Chief warrant, and that's what's on his tombstone.
Oh, so when the war was over, where did you live at?
Well, at that time, I lived in a house that belonged to my dad, just the baby and me.
Just one. You said one baby.
Mm-hmm.
So you said
Tim. And when he couldn't find a job, he was like a fish out of water.
So you just went back in.
And I saw that he just didn't. There was nothing else I could do but say yes. And so he went back. He ended up in Norfolk, and I don't know how long he was there. But
did you go live there?
Dad was so possessive and watched every move I made. I couldn't have any life of my own at all.
Still.
And So I told Frank, I said, if you can either come and get me or I'm going my way. And he got home that weekend. And we loaded up, and the girl that was one of my best friends, her husband was going back at the same time, so they went with us in the car, and she had made some food for us to eat, and she had boiled some eggs, and I was peeling one of those eggs, and I got as sick as a dog. I thought, oh God, I'm pregnant again.
Yeah, so you were.
And I was, Ben.
Ben?
It was Ben. And those boys were 14 months apart.
14 months apart.
But Tim couldn't walk when Ben was born.
Oh, jeez.
And Tim just hated Ben. Because I'd been his possession, you see. I couldn't get any rest. If I sat down, Tim had to be in my lap. Oh, and then Claudia came, and no time, well, it was a little longer before Terry was born. But anyway, I tell you, you learned.
So you had your hands full.
I did. Everywhere I went.
Was he at sea a lot?
Oh, yes.
And so you were pretty much left to fend?
Yes, I raised those children pretty much by myself. And when they got out of the Navy, we got out of the Navy, they didn't know what to do with him. And he gave orders. He started every sentence almost, figuratively speaking, of course, with "now in the Navy," and oh, I got so tired of hearing "now in the Navy." He had the Navy way up. He eventually, though, let up a little bit. Or in the Navy, we wouldn't put up with that.
So he was strict on the boys?
Well, he didn't seem to do anything to correct them until they'd already done it. And he just didn't seem to know how to deal with children. He'd been used to giving orders to young men, and they jumped. And his boys were wondering who he was.
Right.
And
so when he finally retired, was it difficult to figure out what you were going to do next?